USJI Week Challenges of UN on Peacekeeping. My name is Kazuhiro Maeshima, professor at Sophia University, also an operating advisor for USJI. USJI is, as you may know, a research consortium that consists of 8 Japanese leading universities. Every year, we have opportunities to present our research here in Washington, D.C. Today is one of those events. Let me briefly introduce our panel. We have two speakers from my right, Dr. Daisaku Higashi, also Dr. Henk-Jan Brinkman, Peacekeeping Strategy and Partnership Branch, Peacebuilding Support Office, Support Office Chief in United Nations. Also, Dr. Tadashi Anno will serve as a moderator. After our first round of talk, I would like to open the floor to the discussion. I would like to open the discussion to the floor. Okay. Without further ado, let this microphone to Daisaku.
We're supposed to move over there.
Yeah. Yeah. Since he starts here, so we have to move it.
Thank you very much for a great introduction by Professor Maeshima. He's one of the most famous Japanese scholars in terms of the importance. And it's a great honor for me to make some presentation at the seminar at the USJI, which kindly invited us to come to Washington, D.C. to share our view with people here in the Washington, D.C. My name is Daisaku Higashi, professor at Sophia University, a Sophia Institute of International Relations. And I'd like to make some argument about mainly 4 key issues. First, I'd like to explain a little bit about theoretical argument of challenge of constructive legitimacy in peace building, which I've actually published from the Lord Place 2 years ago. And I will also share my experience about Afghanistan based on that same theoretical framework. And I would like to explain a little bit about Iraq, the challenge of the Iraq peace buildings, and the role of the United States and the role of Japan. The challenge of the South Sudan peace building and how the United States engage and how Japan tries to engage. And I try to make some conclusion about the role of the United States and Japan on supporting the activity of peace building. If I can explain a little bit about myself, I started my career as a program director for NHK, Japanese public TV companies, and we created a lot of TV documentary on international conflict, like Middle East peace talk, Vietnam War, Middle East peace talk, North Korean nuclear issues. 2004, I created the Rebuilding Iraq Challenge of the United Nations, interviewing Kofi Annan, Brahimi, and I got a silver medal from the Correspondent Association in New York. But I really want to be expert on the peace building, so I quit my job and I started my master and PhD in the political science at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And then I was, because of my field research in Afghanistan and Timor, I was appointed to the political affairs officer in UNAMA, UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, as a team leader for reconciliation and integrations. And then I got appointment to, or I got a job as associate professor in the University of Tokyo, and I completed my PhD from Canadian University in 2012. And then I was appointed to the Minister Counselor in Japanese mission to the United Nations, again in charge of peace building and the mediations. So I engaged with the United Nations from the side of the United Nations as well. And then I returned to academics, and I published this book in 2005. And I was invited to the tenure position at the Center for Global Education in the Soviet University in 2016. And I just became professor last year. So this is myself, and I will share my view based on those both practitioners' experience and also academic experience. This is the title of my book, Challenge of Constructive Legitimacy in the Peace Buildings. And the thesis of the book is about how, or everybody, or many people have a consensus that legitimacy is very important in creating or making a successful peace building or nation building after the conflict. But not so many people actually have a real account or argument about how legitimate government actually can be constructed in the process of the peace building. So I wanted to make my own argument to address that question for my PhD dissertation, and I'm continuing to do the same research in the last almost 10 years. But I would like to share some definition about the legitimacy first. Ian Hart defined legitimacy as a normative belief that the rule or institution is to be obeyed. And Thomas Frank argued that legitimacy exerts a pull to compliance, which is powered by quality of the rule or rule-making institution, and not by the coercive authority. So it actually exerts a claim to compliance in the voluntary mode. This is an important definition, I think, of legitimacy. So if we define the legitimacy in that way, legitimate government is a government under which majority of the people obey its rule and institution, not by coercion, but by the conviction that compliance is the right thing to do. So once the government in post-conflict setting became legitimate in the eye of local people, I think they are very likely to achieve at least sustained peace and stability within that state, because people start following the rule and the institutions in a voluntary mode. And I make some argument in my book that how the legitimate government can be constructed in the process of the peace buildings. And I argue that there are 4 key actors. One, credible third parties, and in a nation sets up some laws. The second, inclusive political process. If we have a political exclusion against some political, ethnic, tribal groups, it can tend to create a lot of relapse of the conflict. We also need a resource distribution, how to improve the living condition of the people, and the level of the forces, like a coercion, how to create a security sector, like a police and the military. And if you have 4 things, I think I argue that traditional arguments tend to focus on the resource distribution, like money, and the level of the forces, like a gun. But in addition to those 2 factors, I argue that inclusiveness is very key, and also the credible third party, including a nation, is quite important. And if we have those things right, we can have a compliance to the result of the election, constitutions, and the request of democratizations. And if you have repeated compliance, you tend to have a legitimate government. But if you have repeated non-compliance or rejections, maybe government will be eroded. And in terms of the role of the United Nations, I argue that the United Nations is not perfect at all, but compared with some powerful states, like the United States in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Australia in East Timor, or Nigeria in the Sierra Leone, United Nations still seems to have some comparative advantage in giving a sense of the impartiality to the fighting parties. Because fighting party has a lot of mistrust. They cannot trust, for example, the result of the election. These are some credible third parties, and the United Nations seems to have some some comparative advantage in terms of that kind of credibility. So those are my basic arguments. And I did several studies to support and examine my theoretical argument. First study was Afghanistan. Peace building Afghanistan started, as you know, from 2001 after the United States attacked Afghanistan. But the Taliban has regrouped and expanded its territory since 2016. When I conducted field research in 2008, those places, the red area, are almost controlled by the Taliban. So you can see about 50% of the territory was already controlled by the insurgency, mainly by the Taliban. So I conducted research in Kandahar, Wardak, and Kapisa to make some comparative analysis. And I also made like a 70 individual interview with top leadership of the Afghan government and the United Nations, including Minister of Finance and the Minister of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. But in order to know the real voice of the peoples, I also conducted an opinion survey by asking 50 villagers to one place, and I collected about 260 opinion survey in the different 3 provinces, Wardak, Kandahar, and the Kapisa. And based on those opinion survey, I found that overwhelming majority of the people think that political reconciliation or settlement is the only way to create a peace. And even in terms of the coalition government between the Karzai and the Taliban, 98% of the respondents in the Kandahar and Wardak, and 70% of the people in the Kapisa supported that kind of ideas. The reason is that in Kandahar and Wardak, it's a Pashtun people who are dominated, but in the Kapisa, it's Tajik peoples. And as you know, Pashtun is the biggest ethnic group in Afghanistan, and the Taliban is basically based on the Pashtun area. So there are some differences, but still, even the Tajik people supported. 70% of the Tajik people supported the even coalition government between the Karzai and the Taliban. So I established English report from NDPKO first, and also Japanese book, Peacebuilding, in 2009 based on my field research. And in this publication, I made some specific policy recommendations to support establishing new reconciliation mechanisms in Afghanistan to establish the legitimate government in the long run. Because I thought that the inclusivity is a key in Afghanistan. And I made a lot of presentations, both United States and Japan top leadership, including like a deputy special envoy for Afghanistan, Pakistan, U.S. Department. And I got confirmation that the United States would be very happy if Japan support or initiate this kind of support for making a reconciliation mechanism. So I also talked with the Japanese Foreign Minister, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, many Director General. So in 2009, November, the Japanese government announced that it would support reconciliation and integration as one of the three key strategies for assisting Afghanistan. After they pledged $50 million as a seed money to create a reconciliation trust fund. And also I simultaneously applied to UNAMA, and I got the offer from UNAMA as a political affairs officer. So I started working for UNAMA in Kabul, and I was appointed as a chief leader for reconciliations. Because of my personal engagement with this issue. And I worked together with Staffan de Mistura, U.S. Special Envoy for Afghanistan, to create some key mechanisms like Afghan High Peace Council, start negotiation with top leadership of the Taliban, Afghan Peace and Education Program, and also Reconciliation Trust Fund, funded by not only by Japan, but the United States, UK, Australia, Germany, Estonia, and those kind of countries. So we at least created some mechanism to start negotiation with the Taliban. But the political negotiation with the Taliban continued to be very challenged. 2011, President Obama at least announced that it needs political solution in Afghanistan. The Taliban announced in 2012 that it will open the Qatar office to negotiate with the Afghan government. But unfortunately, negotiation between the Afghan government and Taliban mediated by Qatar were starting sometime like for 3 days, but it was quickly suspended in 2012, 2013, and 2015. So there's no sustainable peace talk on Afghanistan. So I think the background of this suspension is there was a fundamental skepticism about the role of the Qatar government, I think by the Afghan government and also president. They are very scared that in the end of the day, Qatar might make mediation between the Afghan, not the Afghan government, but the Taliban and the United States without strong involvement of the Afghan government. So that was, I think, background of the suspending those talks in a very quick way. But this year, the situation has totally changed. So after those series of the failing negotiation, Taliban started demanding that they want to talk directly with the US government. And the Obama administration said, no, you should talk with the Afghan government first. But President Trump is quite innovative enough that he said that, no, it's okay, so then I should start talking with the Taliban. So they started a very long talk for 6 days in Qatar first, January this year, and now they have a second round in this particular moment in the Qatar. And they have got some kind of mutual understanding that the United States basically agreed that it will withdraw the US forces from Afghanistan. The Taliban promised that they will not allow Al-Qaeda or ISIS deploy in Afghanistan in the future. So those are kind of mutual basic understanding. Now they are discussing kind of timetable, exact timetable of the US withdrawal. Taliban demanded like a 6 months withdrawal, and the United States said, no, it might take us 3 years. So, but Taliban argued that once United States Taliban agree on the time framework of the withdrawal of the US forces, the Taliban is ready to start talking with the Afghan government about the governance or political settlement. But even if it becomes realities, there's a big challenge that is the Taliban ready to accept democratic elections as a method to choose a leader of the government in Afghanistan. I believe that this is, in the end of the day, this is one of the most difficult issue on the Afghan peace process. We are not quite sure that Taliban is ready to choose a democratic system to choose a leader. So we still have a big challenges, but in terms of the role of the United States and Japan on Afghan peace building, as you saw it, United States now, Trump administration seems to more determined to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, but making some political settlement with the Taliban. And in terms of Japan, Japan continues to support economic reconstruction of Afghanistan, and as you see, the political reconciliation. So I think there might be some possible collaboration between Japan and the United States, hopefully with the United Nations to advance the talk on the Afghan process. And I heard that the United States is now thinking about making some new UN special envoy for Afghanistan to facilitate the talk. So those are kind of frames that maybe we can think about how we can work together. So those are cases of Afghanistan. Second case is Iraq. As you know, the nation building started in 2003. But the first thing that the US occupation did was dissolution of the Iraqi National Army, which 400,000 people become unemployed, and also dissolved the Ba'ath Party, which actually collapsed the government institutions. So it was quite an exclusive approach. And the role of the nation was also very marginal in 2003. So after the nation building started, we had a huge sectarian conflict between the Syria, Sunni, and the Kurd, as you know. So 2006, it became almost like a civil war in Iraq. But General Petroles, who was quite a shrewd US commander in Iraq at that time, in 2007, decided that they need to include Sunni insurgency to national building process, establishing Iraqi Awakening Council across the Iraqi country and supporting more than 100,000 Sunni insurgents, paying like $300 per month, in exchange of the promise that they will not attack the US forces and also the Iraqi government. And this kind of a reconciliation program drastically resulted in drastic reduction of the insurgencies. So after 2007, as you see, the casualties, so civilian fatality in Iraq, drastically reduced by the end of 2011. And this was the background why US decided to withdraw itself from Iraq by the end of 2011. But unfortunately, just after US withdrawal, the Iraqi government fired the Sunni vice president and the Sunni minister of finance and other political leaders. And also Iraqi government decided to stop the support, financial support for American Council members. So they lost again the income, almost 800,000 people lost their income. So 80,000, yeah. So it became another big problem of the Sunni peoples, and it took only 2 years for ISIS to control 1/3 of the Iraq, utilizing grievance of those Sunni peoples. So it was ironic that the President Obama at that time continued to assert that Iraq need to have an inclusive government. So it's a map of 2015, and 1/3 of the territory of the Iraq was controlled by the ISIS, and they even occupy Fallujah, which is just 50 kilometers from Baghdad. So we are kind of in international panic that, we might do something in Iraq itself. So United States engaged again with Iraq to fight against ISIS, and also Iran sent a lot of militia to fight against ISIS. And the Iraqi government also decided to fight against ISIS. So in the end of 2017, at least ISIS was shrink almost to the edge in the Iraq. So Abadi Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. Abadi declared that police they got some kind of victory against ISIS in the end of 2017. Now in the Syria, it became almost zero, as you know. The United States made some final push. So you could see how the fatality rate was increased in 2006, went down, but it went up again for the fighting against ISIS, and it reduced to 2018. So this is a time for the Iraq to make real, whether or not, to decide whether they can make real, national stability and the peace. And I was very lucky that I was assigned by Foreign Minister of Japan to make some intellectual contribution on the Iraq peace building by visiting Baghdad in Iraq in February 2018, last year. So I met Mr. Maliki, who Vice President Mr. Maliki, who represents Shia bloc of the political Shia political bloc, and also Mr. Rajavi, who represents Sunni political bloc. Mr. Ravi, who represents a secular political bloc, and also Mr. Rabani, who represents Kurdish political bloc. I also made a keynote speech at Al-Nahara Center in Baghdad, which is a key institution for the national defense of Iraq. And I found that although the individual strategy might be different, depending on the political affiliation of the party, it seems that the political leaders in Iraq have some kind of consensus, at least in the oral sense, that they need to have overcome sectarian politics this time to create sustainable peace in Iraq. So I thought it could be one of the hopes that Iraqi might have. There was a national election last May in 2018, and it took almost 6 months for them to create a new coalition government and choose the prime ministers. And at the end of the day, Abdul Mahdi was selected as a prime minister, this person, last October. And again, I was, assigned by Japanese foreign minister to go to Iraq and to make some interesting contributions. So I met former Prime Minister Abadi, who fought against ISIS, and also, Mr. Maliki again. Those people actually created Alliance for Reform and Alliance for Construction. They created the two major alliances of the different political parties and the bloc now in Iraq, and they have some tensions between them. And in terms of Alliance for Reform, Mr. Al-Sadr, the party which is led by Al-Sadr, the religious leader, has about 54 seats, and Mr. Abadi has about 20 seats. But at the same time, Alliance Constructions, which is led by Al-Amiri, had like a 46 seats, and Mr. Maliki has about 25 seats. So those Alliance Constructions and Alliance Reform had a big competition to choose a prime minister last year. But in the end of the day, they decided to choose the person which can be supported by both sides. So in the end of the day, all parties become almost a ruling party, no opposition party now. I think that was a way for them to create some kind of national reconciliation. But in the reality, I heard that this side, which is very close to Iran, is actually more close to the current prime minister. But, so there's some tension between them all the times. I also meet Amr al-Hakim and also former Prime Minister Rabi again. And I also made a lecture for Baghdad universities, and many people, students and professors gathered in Iraq, and I was very happy. But I made one of the suggestions that continuous dialogue should be critical for national reconciliation in Iraq to establish a peace. And I suggest whether Japanese embassy can host this kind of the seminar with head of the Iraqi major political party in the regular basis, so that they can have constant dialogue and discussions. And I want to raise some questions about the role of the United States in Iraq. They still have the leader presence in Iraq, but we didn't see so much active engagement by the United States on the Iraq. So that was something that I want to discuss with you today. In terms, this is my final case. Let me go very quickly. South Sudan became independent in July 2011, and the Vice President Riek Machar was fired. Vice President killed July 2013, and the civil war started at the end of the 2013. So those are two, President Kiir and President Vice President Machar. This is a basic dynamics of the conflict in the South Sudan. And there's a peace agreement between the President Kiir and Riek Machar, which was almost pressured by the neighboring countries like Sudan, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Kenya. And Riek Machar returned to Juba and the transitional government was formed in April 2016. But only 3 months later, military clash started again. And both guards actually started clashing in the president's palace when Vice President and President Kiir met each other in July 6, 2016. So it became a big crash. And the President, Vice President Machar was expelled to the neighboring countries. He and his military was not able to stay in the Juba. So I started my research in Ethiopia and Kenya and Uganda in 2016, 17, 18, intervening Salva Kiir's South Sudanese ambassadors, and also advisor to Riek Machar, Vice President, and also the many mediators, for example, Director of the IGAD, East African Regional Organization, and UN Special Envoy to the EU, which are mediating. And many mediators emphasize that the relation between the President Kiir and the Vice President is not mistrust, but almost like a hatred. It becomes very difficult for them to coexist. And because of the 2 years fighting, this fighting resulted in 2.2 million IDP and 2 million refugees from South Sudan. So South Sudan became quite big corrupt state, unfortunately. So I went also to Uganda refugee camp last year to interview those South Sudanese refugees. There's a revitalized negotiations for making a peace in South Sudan last year. We are not quite sure it's possible to make agreement again, but in the end of the day, last September, President Kiir and Vice President Machar again became a big negotiation mediated by the Mr. Bashir, the president of the Sudan, who really wanted to restore the oil revenue from South Sudan, and also wanted to show his leadership to create a peace. And they agreed on the new peace deal in last September. But implementation of the agreement will be extremely challenging. And I was again assigned by Japanese Foreign Minister to make intellectual contribution to South Sudan after I visited Iraq. So I needed to go there for 20 days until 1 week ago. But Juba, the capital of South Sudan, relatively calm and stable, I found. And I interviewed like a first vice president, number 2 of current South Sudan administration, and the minister in cabinet affairs, Minister of Higher Education, and also the person who is conducting national dialogue, and also many opposition leaders, and also head of the United Nations in South Sudan, and also Ismail Reis, IGAD Special Envoy for South Sudan, who is mediating this conflict. And they also made up, lectures, special lecture for Juba University. Many students are very passionate about listening to questions, so I'm very happy to engage with them. So based on those interviews and the discussion with the peoples, I conclude that maybe there are 3 key differences between the peace agreement 2015-2018. This time, South Sudan decided to create a unified army. The last time, they decided to create a different, separated army, controlled by the Riek Machar and controlled by the President Kiir, but this time they say that they will create a unified army. Second, people in the South Sudan say 2015, the agreement was quite imposed by the side, but they said this time, people of the Kiir and people of the Machar side by side and discussed, and they agree one by one. So they have a more local ownership. Third, I think this is quite critical, but there is not so much commitment and strong ambition to support by Sudan and Uganda last time. But this time it was really President of the Sudan, Mr. Bashir, and also Museveni, President of Uganda, which really pushed both sides to make agreement. And President of the Sudan had a huge leverage on the Riek Machar, the opposition side. And Uganda is a country which continues to support Salva Kiir government. So if they become together, it becomes more effective to create more pressure to implement this agreement. But the challenge is that now, because of the several failure of the South Sudan peace process, USA, UK, Norway, and the EU are very reluctant now to make any financial support to the implementation of the 2018 agreement. This is something that every government official are very lamented, or saying that it's a big challenge. So it's now only Japan which gives major like a financial contribution and implementation of the agreement. And the key challenge is we still don't know whether or not there's a real political will this time. I mean, by President Machar, Anno and by Vice President Machar, to work together, even in the transition government. And they will have, they are supposed to have a national election 3 years later, but they need to have some political stability for next 3 years. We are not quite sure they have a real political will. And also, we need to create this joint force, unifying the forces in a relatively quick way, like 6 months. But I think that this is a really tough and also very expensive project. The government just announced that it costs $280 million to implement the whole peace agreement. The major cost is this create a unified forces across the country. And Japan only made a pledge Japan just provided $1 million, but they need more $279 million. So those are the big challenge financially for South Sudan. So Japan is passionate about supporting the peace agreement by using the IGAT framework and supporting infrastructure projects in the South Sudan. But the United States, for example, Bon Jolton, special security advisor to the president, declared last year that we will not provide any loan to the South Sudan government led by the same bankrupt leaders. It's a very strong word, right? So we are not quite sure how the United States actually will engage with current international or peace agreement of the South Sudan. So if I go to the conclusion, policy of the United States in Afghanistan, it's a dialogue with disengagement. South Sudan, it's basically disengagement, but Iraq, there's still big military presence. Japan tried to keep engaging with the reconstruction and the peace process in those three countries, but the Japanese commitment, the scale of the Japanese commitment is actually very limited. So the impact that Japan can do is quite limited compared with the United States and also compared with China. So I have insisting that Japan can play a role as a global facilitator. Even in the report that I just distributed today, it might not be able to create a solution, but could facilitate the dialogue by different political, fiscal, and tribal functions so that they can identify a better approach. So my question for today is, can Japan collaborate with the United Nations and also maybe the United States on those fronts of peace building as like some kind of like playing a role as facilitators in the different part of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daisaku. Well, next is Dr. Brinkman.
We can basically
Can I close this? Can I close this?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. I will not have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will not talk about specific countries in particular, but more in general the environment that we are facing in the world with regard to violent conflict and the role of UN peacebuilding in that in particular. The international community spent $233 billion over 10 years in crisis management, in response. And I'm only counting UN peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, official development assistance, and donor assistance to refugees in their own countries, which is also counted as official development assistance, which is a little bit of a shame. That's quite a lot of money, and compared to peace building, it is even more, because the peace building fund that my office manages allocated last year 280 million, but it has, which was a record, but it has been receiving between 100 and 200 million a year in contributions. And what it really shows is that the traditional tools of the United Nations, which is peacekeeping operations and mediation and using the good office of the Secretary General, has become really less effective in the kind of conflicts that we see today. The UN was founded in an era that wars were mostly between countries, but after a period of colonial wars and wars of independence, the most dominant form of conflict was civil wars, and over time they have even morphed in all kinds of violence that are even difficult to describe as civil wars, in terms of you have one insurgent group fighting the government about the economic system or the political system, which was the main case during the Cold War. And now you have gangs, you have ragtags, you have rebels, you don't have front lines, you often don't have uniforms, and it is much more difficult to identify who you are actually fighting and for what reason. So in Syria alone, there are more than 1,000 armed non-state groups. So the period where the United Nations could put two groups of people in a room, basically communist and capitalist, to put it very simple, negotiate a peace agreement, and then put peacekeepers in between and implement a peace agreement, worked very well for a very long time. It was successful in Angola, Mozambique, in Central America, but now it is much more difficult. So we are really bogged down in protracted crises such as the South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, with peacekeeping operations and large peacekeeping operations, which cost almost $1 billion a year. Also the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and with very little view of a political solution in sight. And we see over the last couple of years an increase in violent conflicts, which is very disturbing, because we have seen a very long decline, actually over millennia, and certainly after World War II. I mean, World War I and World War II were really peaks that were kind of an aberration of the 20th century, quite dramatic. But since the World War II, there has been overall a decline in violent conflict for decades. But at the moment, we have seen an increase since about 2010, and we've reached levels of violent death that hasn't been seen in about 3 decades. And the number of countries in violent conflict has also not been higher in 30 years. So what my point would be is that because the traditional instruments of the UN, peacekeeping and good officers and mediation and facilitation, are less effective, we need to have a different approach. And the approach that we should use is a much more comprehensive approach, using all different segments of the UN. We need the development actors, we need humanitarian actors, we need human rights actors, and we need all of them being involved in peace building, to look at the causes and the drivers of peace building, and really work on prevention. And we know that prevention works. It saves lives, it saves resources, it's cost effective, and the numbers are quite stark, actually. So if you look at cost effectiveness, for example, $1 invested in prevention and peace building saves you down the line between $4 or $59, depending on the methodology and the study. But even if we take the low side, if we take $4 per 1 to 4, that means that you can fail in your attempts 3 out of 4 times and still play even. So we know that peace building is a risky business. It's not a hard science, it's more of an art, and you need to experiment and try and error, and you need to adapt to the circumstances. There is no one-size-fits-all, no blueprint. So sometimes you fail, sometimes you don't get the results that you expect. But still, the effort to focus on prevention rather than on response and crisis management is worth the effort. In 2015, we had at the UN reviews that almost covered the entire UN system. We had an in-depth review of peacekeeping operations, which was initiated by the Secretary General. We had a review of the peace-building architecture, and that included my office, but it also looked at how my office and the Peacebuilding Commission and the Peacebuilding Fund that we support and manage respectively, how they interact with the rest of the UN system and how the rest of the UN system is doing with regard to peacebuilding. And then we had a review of the development system and operation. And then because it was the end of 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals that were adopted in the year 2000, in early 2012, the member states started a discussion to look at what should the development agenda after 2015 look like. And in September 2015, the member states of the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We had also a big conference on financing for development in Addis Ababa, a conference in Japan, actually, in Sendai, on disaster risk reduction. And then in 2015, at the end, we had both an important resolution that my office supported on youth, peace and security, 2250, which was similar and more as seminal as the resolution on women, peace and security, 1325, adopted in the year 2000. And we had the climate change accord in Paris. So 2015 was really a big year in terms of agreements among member states. And it showed that the UN still can play a role on the international stage, and it still is seen as valid and an important platform to strike international and multilateral global deals. I wanted to say a little bit more on the peace-building architecture review that was initiated in 2015 and was concluded in 2016 with the adoption of a resolution in the General Assembly and the Security Council that were basically identical. And that resolution introduced the term sustaining peace, which was a new concept. I was not so much in favor when I first heard it. Why do we need a new concept? We have peace building and we have trouble enough to explain peace building to a lot of people, so why would we now need to explain sustaining peace? But I have come around on that. I've actually been quite surprised how quickly this term has taken root. Certainly among the member states and in the resolutions and in the discussions we see at the United Nations, but also among think tanks, about NGOs and academics. So what's so important about sustaining peace and what's so new about sustaining peace? Well, first of all, I think what was very important, and I recognize that, but I think it's even more important than I recognized it in the beginning, is that it is a concept that has a positive connotation rather than peace building, which has a negative connotation. Peace building, and moreover, in the Security Council, the agenda item was called post-conflict peace building, and Russia always insisted that we put post-conflict in front of peace building. So that limited also how we use the concept peace building to after a peace agreement. So sustaining peace is something that is much clearer recognized as universal. Everybody wants to sustain peace, right? But not everybody thinks that peace building needs to take place in their country because they're not coming out of a civil war. So, and they're not on the agenda of the Security Council. But sustaining peace is clearly a universal concept, just like the 2030 Agenda. Although the word universal does not appear in the resolution, it does have a universal appeal. And it just makes it much easier to talk with countries about we want to sustain peace in your country rather than we want to prevent violent conflict in your country and you are at risk and you're doing a lot of things wrong. And you start with a much more positive connotation. So that is, I think, a really important shift. But I wanted to emphasize 4 different elements that the resolution that are really the key, I think. And again, for peace builders, this might mean nothing new, but in the UN, where change is usually incremental, actually this resolution is quite fundamentally different from the way previously. So the first is what I talked about already, that we now clearly recognize that peace building and sustaining peace that needs to happen before, during, and after violent conflict, throughout the conflict cycle. So they talk about preventing of outbreak, of continuation, of recurrence, and escalation. And so that is a very important difference. And the Peacebuilding Fund that my office manages, for example, are clearly now also engaging in countries that are still have an ongoing conflict. For example, in Yemen, where we have a project with the World Bank to make sure that the institutions of Yemen, the state, don't collapse and continue to be able to service the population with social services. It also recognizes, and very important for me as more of a development economist, is that you need to start preventing violent conflict at a much earlier stage before you have smoke arising and the crisis management part of the UN springs into action. You really need to look at more structural factors down the road. And then the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, are a really good way of approaching things. Because what the study we did with the World Bank on Pathways for Peace showed is that exclusion, inequalities between groups, which we call horizontal inequalities, are a very important driver of violent conflict. And horizontal inequalities around political power, about access to economic resources, access to natural resources, access to justice, are really factors that eventually will drive a country into a violent conflict. And actually, Daisaku was partly illustrating that with the case of Iraq, when the US withdrew and Maliki kicked out all the Sunnis out of his government. It was clear of setting the stage for an insurgency by the Sunnis, which indeed was what was followed. That was really a big mistake. And I would also argue that the presence of the US was just not only military because of that, but really had an important role in enforcing certain norms in the country. And clearly the Iraqi government felt that as soon as the US left, that they could do whatever they wanted. The second element that I think is really important in the concept of sustaining peace is that we really need to look at coherence within the UN system and at comprehensive approaches. And I partly hinted at it already, that we cannot prevent violent conflict anymore today if we don't engage with all the actors in the UN system, from the development to the political actors. We need to break down the silos, which is a huge issue not only for the UN, but for national governments as well. We can see sometimes that certain countries, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is the one represented by New York, is not always coordinated, for example, with the finance ministries who are represented here in Washington at the World Bank and the IMF. And if you then also look at WHO, where the health ministry sits, and the FAO, where the agriculture ministry sits, you do see these sometimes diverging opinions, and you see the same in the UN. It is a real problem, and it's not unique to bureaucracies or governments. It's also that the same kind of siloed approach happens in all big organizations, including the private sector. And I think, for example, the success of the iPhone and Steve Jobs was that he absolutely insisted that the engineers and the designers sit together designing an iPhone. And that was the unique element where he could break down the silos within Apple. So the emphasis on early and structured prevention is really important because you have a much larger set of instruments available. And it is, of course, much cheaper. As I said, 232 billion in 10 years just for crisis response, you can really do a lot with if you talked about more earlier prevention, 5 or 10 years down the line. And we know that the drivers have become much more multidimensional. Von Clausewitz said in the 19th century, war is politics by different means. And the Cold War was very much focused on a very simple dichotomy. But that is not the case anymore these days. And we don't even always know what the violence, what for objectives they have. And they can go from criminal to terrorist to running human trafficking operations or drug operations. It's all very fluid and unclear. So within the UN, we need to, as people work in the peace and security side of the house really need to work very closely with the development actors. As the Pathways for Peace report also shows, is that you really need to look also at social services and how they are distributed within the country, across different groups, across regions, because any disparities in terms of that can be used by political actors to mobilize identity around exclusion or inequalities is really a recipe for disaster. Addressing access to social services, which was clearly an issue, for example, in the civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia, but there's still an issue in the north of Mali, in the north of Uganda, in the outside regions of Central African Republic, and also in South Sudan in terms of the ethnic composition. And what is interesting, Daisaku talked a lot about legitimacy. There's very interesting research about the delivery and social services and the legitimacy of government. We made that mistake as well in the UN, that we originally thought that the theory of change was actually quite simple. You deliver social services and the legitimacy of the government increases. And you pay taxes and you get something in return. But it turns out not to be the case, that neither the quantity nor the quality, nor who delivers this, has a direct relationship with the legitimacy of the government. The only thing that consistently is appearing as an important factor is a dialogue mechanism, is a grievance mechanism, where the people feel that everybody has access to, if there is a problem with the quantity or the access or the quality, irrespective of which religion you are, what ethnicity you are, or where you live in the country. So, and it is turned out to be even that grievance mechanism, just the presence of it increases the legitimacy of the government. Even if the people don't use it, but just the fact that it's there, people know that they can go there, is very critical. So I'm getting now to my third element of sustaining peace, and that is the emphasis on national ownership, and in particular on inclusivity. And there we get very close also to Daisaku's point, the four elements that he identified. So the national ownership is, of course, something that all member states, in particular the developing countries and countries like China and Russia, emphasize all the time. That it needs any activity of the UN, whether it's the development system or the peace and security side of the house, need to work in support of national governments. The governments need to lead. But the national ownership needs to go beyond governments, and that is very clearly identified in these resolutions, is that you need to involve all stakeholders. And there's a beautiful phrase there that says that that the needs of all segments of the population need to be addressed. And that is a concept that is very close to the leaving no one behind concept in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And then it specified specific groups of women and youth, civil society, the private sector, but you can go much broader, parliamentarians, the opposition, which is really important that when a particular country is in government, then you deal with that particular party. But you need to be very sure whatever support you give, that you also involve the opposition in engaging in important state building and nation building and peace building processes, because then they might feel excluded if you don't do that. And exclusion is really one of the most important drivers. Chuck Hall, who is a professor here in town, wrote a book, Why Peace Fails, and he identified one consistent factor among, I think, 59 cases that he studied, is that the exclusion of a particular group in a peace agreement or after a peace agreement that ultimately led to the relapse into violent conflict. So this focus on inclusion is really important. And with women, for example, we have very strong evidence that the inclusion of women in peace negotiations, in peace processes and peace building processes makes the process much more sustainable, and much less likely to relapse into violent conflict. So this is also something that is very much emphasized by the Pathways for Peace report, is that we need to build really broad coalitions to create change in the country. We know that change usually means that the elite will either lose or diminish in political or economic power. So you need to create a coalition of critical actors and critical mass to counter that status quo forces to create change. And I like to compare that, and I borrow this from somebody, with soccer. I'm from the Netherlands, and we have a very famous soccer player called Johan Cruyff, who invented the new way of soccer playing, and it's called total soccer, total football, which means that every single player on the field can, in principle, play every single position on the field. So the idea was that through that, by being very mobile and being able to move players around all the time, you create a sense of that you have more players on the field than you actually have. And that is also what you need to do when you want to create change in a country. Because if you take an example of education reform, you can quickly get the teachers' union as opposing every change that you want to bring in terms of education. But if you then include the parents in the discussion, if you include the private sector in the discussion who have an interest in having good students graduate, if you include the students themselves, if you include other civil society groups, if you include reform-minded people within the government in your coalition, you have a much bigger chance of reaching a change than before. And finally, the fourth element, and that's maybe also not new and normally emphasized, is the importance of partnerships. And the UN is never alone. The UN is rarely the biggest. In countries such as Central African Republic, where we do have an almost $1 billion per year peacekeeping operation, we are the biggest actor. But in a lot of other countries like Afghanistan, where you of course have an international military presence, and the political presence of the UN is much smaller, we are not the biggest at all. So we need to work with other actors, also in light of the previous point that I made about building coalitions. You need to work with civil society organizations, the private sector, and in particular regional and sub-regional organizations. And they have become really important over the last 20 years or so. If you look at the role of the African Union in Africa, for example, now, or ECOWAS, it is dramatically different from what existed before, or even if you look at the previous organization, the Organization of African Unity, in enforcing norms and standards, in particular around non-constitutional change in governments. So when there is a coup d'etat, the African Union is usually very quick in making statements that this is not acceptable, or even suspends the membership of the member. And you see that, for example, in what happened in Burkina Faso, in Gambia, when there was an election and the long-term dictator refused to accept the results. ECOWAS, the organization of West African states, really got into action and then put actually military forces on the border to reinforce that the idea that if you not accept these elections, we're gonna enforce it by military means, and that did indeed the leader accepted her elections in the end and went into exile. As the idea of challenges is in the title of today's seminar, I want to end with a few challenges that we face within the UN, and some of them are very linked to those 4 key elements of the Sustaining Human Resolutions. But some are a little bit broader. The first one, I want to re-emphasize again that the UN is very fragmented, and we need to really increase coherence. And this Secretary General has done a really terrific job, I think, in terms of the way he has reformed the UN, the peace and security part of the UN, but also the development side of the UN. And we're certainly not there yet, it's still work in progress, but I think the initial design and the initial impetus from the Secretary General himself has been very good. The second thing I wanted to mention is that doing a good conflict analysis is very difficult. And the UN is weak in three particular areas. What we need to do is not only look at the political factors, which is a traditional way of doing conflict analysis, but really look at integrated multidimensional risk analysis that really looked at all the areas across the UN spectrum, from political peace and security to environment and social and economic, etc. But the economic and development side is rather weak. So we have a great set of economists who can predict balance of payments crisis and debt crisis, but linking that to what are the political implications is really difficult. If you look, for example, what's happening in Sudan at the moment, the protest on the streets started about bread prices, and now it's about regime change. So that transition went very quickly in just a few weeks. So that's the first week. The second is what I kind of implied already is analyzing how different threats are interacting with each other. So how does a climate change in the Sahel multiply other threats or other drivers of violent conflict that really makes it easier that they escalate into something worse? And then the third weakness is that even if you have a terrific multidimensional risk analysis, it is still difficult to then deduce and imply what are the prioritized and sequenced actions that the UN system or the international community should take. So who does what, where, and when over the short, medium, and longer term. And the longer term, I really want to use the 2030 agenda or so a 10, 15-year period. And that is very difficult, and we see that every day when we get proposals for the Peacebuilding Fund, and usually the agencies, I mean, it certainly has improved, but I'm making a little bit of a caricature, but that the World Food Program would take a standard food security project, makes an introduction about the conflict that is taking place, but then would do exactly the same as they would always be doing. So having these risks and knowing that what you need to change on the ground to make it also have a peace building outcome besides your food security objective is difficult. And we have capacity on that, but it's very scattered and it's not well organized in terms of we have a way to reach it and deploy it whenever it's needed. Two more things I want to mention is the fragmented funding that we face, which reinforces the fragmentation we already have. Peacekeeping operations are financed by a set budget in the United Nations, so they are well financed because it's international law that countries have to abide to pay a certain percentage. Peacebuilding is all voluntary. Development is almost all voluntary. Humanitarian is almost all voluntary. But it's generally much better funded when there is a crisis, and that is the paradox that we face, that usually people are very generous when the images on CNN are very severe, but of course it's very difficult to fund peace building and prevention because the result is a non-event. The dog didn't fight. And that leads me to the last aspect, and that is the measurement issue that is so difficult in peace building. And that really runs counter to a lot of the emphasis that donors have put on results. They want to see results, and of course that is a good objective. They want to be able to sell to Parliament why they have spent so much money on official development assistance or peace building. They need to send it to the general public because it's their tax money, and so there's a very strong push for results. The problem, though, is that it has become excessive. And Andrew Nachios, who used to be the administrator of USAID, wrote a wonderful paper about this. It's called the Counter-Bureaucracy, and he defines it as OMD, the Obsessive Measurement Disorder. And actually, at one point, he tried to determine how many people in USAID are involved in this. And he found that a third of USAID staff does nothing but counting, reporting to headquarters, filling in log frames, etc. A third. And that had actually as a consequence in USAID that a lot of the experts left because they felt that the decisions were being made by bureaucrats and accountants rather than really expertise. And it also had as a result that projects started to switch from what is measurable rather than what is important. So what is measurable is not always important, and what is important is not always measurable. And certainly in peace building, things are very important, but not always measurable, or it takes a long time before they become measurable. And that is a really dangerous shift that we see. And as a result, the time frame has really narrowed. Andrew Nachios noticed a decline of the time frame of USAID project from 10 years to 1 year. Now, in 1 year, you can do very little peace building. In 10 years, you have a good shot. So that is a very important, I think, discussion that we need to take and have with the donors. So we'll leave it here, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Henk-Jan. Well, next, Tadashi's comment.
Well, Professor Maeshima introduced me my role as one of the moderator, but I see my role as one of an irritator because I'm the guy who stands between the audience and the long-awaited Q&A session. And I'm also because I'm in the habit of kind of hair splitting, and this is not my field. I'm coming from some more traditional kind of security studies, but I'm generally interested in the sort of conditions under which sort of a durable and peaceful political order becomes possible. So from that angle, I'm going to say a few things about the problem of political inclusivity in peace building. Is it coming along? Come on. Hey, come on. Where is the slideshow? Oh, now here it is. So, well, I mean, you know, like, ideas that were presented today include, you know, the nature of the conflict is changing. We need new approaches to sort of peace building. We need the more sort of a long-term, sustained kind of approach that emphasizes legitimacy. And for that purpose, political inclusivity is one of the key points. And it's a kind of idea that makes a lot of intuitive sense. I mean, if you have a sort of post-conflict society in need of peace building, and you're sort of excluding a segment of the population from the process of peace building, of course, that's a recipe for disaster. You're rendering the resultant political, social, and economic arrangement procedurally illegitimate and therefore substantively unstable. You know, that makes a lot of sense. And in addition to making a lot of sense, you know, inclusivity sounds good. It sounds good. Who would like to make an argument for exclusivity as opposed to inclusivity, right? So it's a very difficult idea to argue against. But nevertheless, just for the sake of the argument, I'm going to play the role of the skeptic or the devil's advocate and voice some nagging doubts about this concept of political inclusivity in peace building. Okay. And I think I have 3 or 4 points. Number one, are there limits to inclusivity? What are the limits, if there are such limits, right? I mean, the first example is not a very good one. I mean, Weimar Germany as a case of peace building. I mean, this is, I mean, if there were sort of political forces like the Nazis, are you going to be including them in the sort of peace building process? Closer to the examples we are talking about, what about the role of the ISIS in the Syrian peace process? I'm not too well informed about the Syrian peace process, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not recall anyone sort of making a proposal for actually including the Islamic State in the peace process. There was no question about it, right? If anything, exclusion of the IS was one of the few things that other political actors could agree on in the Syrian peace process. And I think it was the fear of common shared fear of the sort of, the Islamic State that drove a number of parties, both inside and outside of Syria, toward the negotiation table. So I would argue that in the Syrian peace process, some sort of exclusivity, of at least, with concerning at least the Islamic State, is what sort of drove the peace process forward, although tentatively, right? It might be argued that, we're talking about inclusivity in the process of peace building, and that is to assume that all the parties concerned have already signed onto a ceasefire agreement and abided by it, and the very fact of these political forces signing onto an agreement and abiding by it would naturally qualify all these concerned parties for legitimate parties to be included in the peace-building process. But I'm not exactly sure, because it is entirely conceivable that dangerous political forces like IS or the Nazis would sign a peace agreement and abide by it for tactical reasons, for the purpose of later taking advantage of it and dominating other political forces. And other political forces are justifiably concerned about exactly such a possibility, and they might not want to include those guys in the peace process. And for us outsiders to go into the post-conflict country and tell other political forces, hey, you guys should include all these people because of these theoretical literature or something, that is a very difficult position to argue, I think. And of course, you can't exclude the constituency that is supporting the sort of radical group, like the Sunni Muslims for the IS or something. But it is all social groups needs to be included in the process. But that is different from including the political groups that may represent, radical political groups that might claim to represent some of these groups. That's not point number one. Point number two. This is a clarification point, but political inclusivity as a process, in the process of peace building, I think there's a very strong argument for it. If you exclude somebody from the process of peace building, that's a recipe for disaster. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be shooting for always be shooting for an inclusive political, economic, and social arrangement as the end outcome. Look at the history of Sudan, for example. Until 1956, Sudan was under a joint colonial rule by Britain and Egypt. And in 1956, Sudan becomes independent. And at that point, people in South Sudan, the black, predominantly Christian population, becomes afraid that now we're going to be ruled by the Arab Muslims in Khartoum or something, right? And what happens? Of course, the country descends into a civil war. And after 2 episodes of lengthy civil war, fast forward to 2005, you have a comprehensive peace agreement, which is basically, which laid the foundation for later peaceful kind of divorce. And I think that the situation in South Sudan is not entirely stable, but the fact that South Sudan split from North Sudan, that I think was a good thing. And if you also look at the situation of the Kurdish people in Iraq, or the what seems like a virtual kind of two-state solution that you have in the Bosnia and Herzegovina or something, I think that inclusivity at the end point of political social arrangement is not necessarily a desirable goal, and that depends on concrete cases. Inclusivity as a process, I think, is a very there's a very strong case for that, I think. Well, maybe they're telling me to this is a sign that I should wrap up or something.
Don't move so much.
I'm being censored. Pitfalls of, this is a kind of more theoretical consideration of the points I already made and linking it to this kind of idea of liberal international order, right? I think it is fair to say that liberalism has been the dominant political, economic, and social theories of our time, and many of the norms and practices in international society today have been informed by some form of liberal theory. And liberalism rejects discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, religion, language, gender, sexual orientation, etc. And because of that, it has an inclination toward inclusivity and integration. I mean, if liberalism tends to assume that each and every individual should be able to work with every other diverse group of individuals, as long as all share a common commitment to basic liberal democratic norms. And it has achieved a great success in the past, but I think there's also a danger to it. And one of the dangers I already mentioned, I mean, the openness and inclusivity of a liberal social and political system could be taken advantage of by violent political forces that infiltrate and could overturn liberal social and political orders. The other danger, I think, is the idea that is often held by liberals themselves. And by the way, I'm not talking about liberals in the specifically American sense. I'm talking more about liberalism in the broader political theory sense. But liberals might tend to imagine that liberalism is an inclusive political theory that is capable of accommodating all kinds of individuals with legitimate aspirations. But I think, and I do think that liberalism is a very broad and tolerant and inclusive kind of a political idea, and therefore it has wide appeal around the world. But unfortunately, I don't think it is an entirely inclusive, entirely neutral kind of political ideology. It is still a partisan political idea that does exclude certain type of social and political organizations and cultural orientations. I would say that liberalism is a political theory that is based on what I would call individualist social ontology, or the notion that basically the society consists of the fundamental reality in society is the existence of separate individuals, and individuals are the ultimate legitimate locus of decision making, and all groups and communities, so-called, are allowed to exist only to the extent that they secure ongoing consent of the individual members. And unfortunately, I don't know, I mean, not all cultures and ideologies in the world today accept those individualist social ontology, and seen from the viewpoint of those ideologies, liberal society and liberal ideologies sometimes experienced as highly oppressive, and therefore liberal attempts to include the entire world often ends up being unsuccessful. So I think liberalism lacks a consistent theory on how to construct stable political communities and how to draw boundaries between those political communities. And therefore, I think liberals should use caution in approaching problems of peace building, especially in trying to determine what are the legitimate kind of a framework for constructing a new kind of political community. And here I think we need a more empirical, bottom-up, case-by-case approach. And the last point, Japan as a global facilitator. I think Japan, because of its Japan has a lot of imperial and colonial baggage in East Asia, but when it comes to Middle East or Africa, Japan carries less baggage compared with some other countries. Japan might have an advantage in facilitating bottom-up, case-by-case approach in peace building. But I'm also skeptical here because to some extent I think that Japan's abilities to play this role may in part depend on the good cop, bad cop situation that might exist. Because the Americans, Professor Higashi was referring to the American role and the Japanese role. But to some extent it seems to me that the presence of the American bad cop, accept human rights and democracy or else, that kind of allows Japan to portray itself in the role of the good cop, which says, oh, okay, human rights and democracy is important, but look, we are less kind of adamant than those guys are, and we are ready to listen, So I think the U.S.-Japan combination is very nice, but if, without the presence of the bad cop, I'm not sure if this good cop can play very much of a role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tadashi. Well, up the discussion to the floor. But do you want to some comment on his suggestion regarding inclusiveness and exclusiveness of Japan's law, if you happen to?
Maybe one thing I would say. I mean, I do have some sympathy for the skepticism, but I do think that there has been a change that makes inclusivity much easier because of technology. And it is maybe not the inclusivity that we thought about, in the past. That clearly you cannot have a country of 40 million people at the negotiation table. That's very clear. You need to have a selection of people that need to be represented. But the fact that Taliban, for example, was excluded from the Bonn talks in 2001 might be a reason to doubt whether that was a good decision, and whether they're looking at ISIS in Syria might create a similar situation down the line, in which ISIS will return in a much different way, and not maybe focusing on land, but on doing the same guerrilla tactics that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda uses. But I want to go back to the technology. South Africa reformed its security sector after apartheid, and they wrote a white paper on the security sector. And it was, of course, the security sector was hated in South Africa by the black population, and it was mostly a white security force. So it was clear that it needed a drastic change in how the security forces were organized. And there was a lot of baggage that had to be discussed and carried forward. So an independent activist from a think tank wrote that white paper, and that white paper was discussed through and throughout with all stakeholders, with the defense industry, with black populations, with different ethnic groups, with the church, different civil society groups, the private sector in general. For 2 years, I think it was discussed throughout the society. And there was very heated discussions on it. There was also an online platform where people could provide comments. And that's what I meant. You can actually now, with technology, you can actually reach everybody in a society. So maybe in a peace negotiation you have to be selective, but in the end, you can really reach everybody. And what I have argued with inclusivity is, when we negotiate a peace, you have to have the bad guys with the guns, and usually they are the guys. But when you build peace, you need to have also the people without the guns, and incrementally being more inclusive over time. And so it is parallel to the point I made about legitimacy of government and social services and having a grievance mechanism. So having a possibility for the entire population to say something on the security sector reform is really important. And the constitution in South Africa was also open to an online platform. And 2 million people out of a population of about 40 million provided comments on the constitution. And in the end, that white paper on security sector reform was debated in shouting matches in Parliament about it. But in the end, it was adopted with consensus in Parliament. With consensus. In 1994, of 1995-96, so immediately after the president. Thank you.
Okay. How about Daisaku? Okay. I'd like to open the discussion to the floor. Any questions? When you have a question, please state your name and affiliation first. First.
Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting in-depth presentation. I'm from the Foreign Ministry of Japan, currently interning at the US Congress. My question is, I do hope as well that if we were to see the end of the Syrian conflict, what is, in South Africa was the Truth Commission, in Rwanda I assume it was I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but it was the Gaga words? Or are we sending, yes, sorry, or are we sending, are we assuming that we're going to send President Assad to a criminal justice? Which one do you think? And how do you judge which one's more effective? I understand it's case by case, but in the serious case, I want to know which.
Maybe take a few questions or
Please.
Yes. Sorry. My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I used to be with the World Bank a long time. My question is to Professor Maeshima, especially in the case of Afghanistan. And I know that the case, the theme of this seminar is roles of US and Japan. But can you really discuss the future of Afghanistan without discussing the role of China, say, especially in terms of reconstruction, with Afghanistan being right in the middle of the old Silk Road and their major efforts. The other side, the other aspect I worry about, both for US and Japan, is that both countries have a huge budget deficit, especially Japan, which is known to have the largest budget deficit in the world. And so when you discuss giving any financial support to anyone else, all you are talking of is borrowing more money and just making yourself look good. How long can that be sustained?
Any more questions? Okay, please.
Beata Borodicz from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland, specializing on Japanese politics, so not really peacekeeping policy or operations. So I have a question maybe to all panelists. Like you mentioned inclusiveness as one of those important factors. So based on your experience, like what kind of main causes, main obstruction to this, to implementation of this idea, which you could mention, or maybe this is just case on case base. And the other question, I think it's more to Henk-Jan. It's about, you mentioned that the number of conflicts in the world has been increasing. So like, could you just like maybe try to elaborate what is the main reason, and how is it, how do you see it in relation to arms control? Because like conflicts are obviously carried out with the arms. They are produced and traded. So on one hand, the peacekeeping policy, the peacekeeping efforts, and on the other hand, the same states that try to implement peace, they produce arms and export it. So how do you, I mean, like, how do you look at this issue?
Okay.
Thank you very much for great questions and comment. In terms of the Syrians, I also have been doing research about Syria, so I'm happy to respond to your question. But Syria is almost could be ended by like a military victory, unfortunately. If you look at the map of the full control of that, 80% of that territory is almost controlled by the government. The 20% is controlled by, no, like a 15 or 20 is controlled by the Kurdish, like I said, Syrian, democratic forces, and just 5 to 10% is controlled by the kind of moderate opposition, which was supported by Turkey. So government is very confident that they can have a kind of military victory. So their basic policy for the reconciliation is that total surrender by the insurgency opposition first, denouncing their weapons, and if they do both, the government will give the amnesty to the people who used to fight against the government. So those are kind of 3 principles of the current Syrian government on how to include or reintegrate the people who used to fight against the government. So I'm not that quite sure that I will create some national mechanisms like a reconciliation trust committee to have kind of real reintegration and reconciliation with the people, because basically they think that they can restore their territory, not by the political settlement, but by the military victory. So Syria is a quite different case from another one. Thank you for some questions. It's okay for me also to answer the questions. Yes, the role of China is, I think, very crucial in Afghanistan. Actually, China really wanted to be mediator between the government, Afghan government, and the Taliban for a long time, but I think there's some skepticism about role of China because China might have huge leverage on Afghanistan. So I think the United States still prefer not China but Qatar to be mediators. But in terms of the economic reconstruction, China already made a huge investment in Afghanistan because Afghanistan has many different resources, mineral resources. And Taliban used to attack those Chinese companies, but we heard that China already paid a lot of commissions to the Taliban, so the Taliban did not stop attacking Chinese companies and exploiting a lot of mineral resources in Afghanistan. So in the end of the day, if there's some political settlement between the Taliban and the Afghan government, I'm almost sure that China has a huge ambitions to make more and more economic support and reconstructions. And in terms of sustainability of the Japanese financial support, yes, this is a big question. We used to have $10 billion for the ODA. Now it's become almost $4 billion. I think that's one of the reasons I believe that it's not only the quantity of the support, but the quality of the support is very important. So capacity building is one thing, increasing effectiveness of the institution is another thing. And also maybe, playing a role as some facilitation for the dialogue could be another component that Japan can play by using some credibility which we established, at least in the Middle East and Africa in the last 70 years. In terms of the major obstacle of the inclusivities, I made that presentation in IPI last year, the internship in New York, and I argued there are maybe two major obstacles. One is the fear that once you made a concession to the opponent or enemies, you might lose entire political powers and economic position and resources, and that you might be even the prosecuted. This is the kind of fear that the both sides of the South Sudanese government and also opposition continue to have in their negotiation. Once they lose some leverage or they make some concession to the others, that they might actually lose the political powers, and if they lose the political powers, they will lose the economic resource, which could come from the oil revenues, and even they might prosecute it in the future. So those mutual fears and mistrust, but hatred, mistrust are one of the reasons. Second major reason could be like a conviction that one side can make a military win or victory. So. And it could be applied to the case of Syria. Syria really thinks that now they can have a military power or victory, so they continue to ignore some kind of political process which was mediated by the UN Special Envoy for the Syria in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think those two major factors are quite consistent with what Staffan Stettman argued 20 years ago in his piece or article about why political settlement or negotiated settlement of the internal conflict or civil war is very difficult. Yeah. So I think, but those are my temporary arguments about the principal reasons of political exclusion in the conflict. Thank you.
Yeah, just a few points. On Syria, I'm really not an expert on that, and I don't know exactly how it's going to end. It's probably likely to be a military victory. But the UN is insisting that there needs to be a political process about whatever end of the war there will be. And that has to be an inclusive process where indeed many different groups need to be able to take part in. And in that sense, I think President Bashir needs to be part of that process. Sorry, Assad, I'm confusing. Another one who was indicted by the ICC. And then you need to really have a reconciliation process. I don't think that there is a way around that. The UN is also insisting that war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide cannot be subject for immunity. That needs to be addressed. And just like with the case of Yugoslavia, Milosevic was part of the peace negotiation in Dayton, Ohio, but then in the end he did end up in the tribunal in The Hague. Unfortunately, he died in jail before he was convicted. What is really unique, I think, about this case in Syria is that the evidence is really dramatic. There have been people who have been able to draw a direct line from the president to specific acts of crimes against humanity, with orders that Assad himself signed, and reports coming back on what the result of the order was. And that is quite unique in, I think, the area of international criminal law, because just pictures of people killed is not a reason that you can convict somebody. And that's why Gbagbo, for example, in Cote d'Ivoire was just acquitted in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, because they were not able to draw these lines directly from him to the acts of violence that took place in Cote d'Ivoire around after the election in 2010. So we will have to see how that will end up. The questions on the rise of conflicts, I mean, I think there are a couple of major trends, mega trends, I would say, that are colliding at the moment. You have a world that moved from a bipolar world during the Cold War with clearly two hyperpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, to a unipolar world immediately after the Cold War ended in 1989. We are moving towards a multipolar world, but we're not there yet. And I think, as the Secretary General has said, we are kind of in a chaos period, because that system of a multipolar world where indeed Russia and China and India and Brazil, great countries, emerging powers, that position has not been crystallized yet. But I have clearly seen in my 30 years at the UN an enormous shift in who has the power at the UN. And it has clearly shifted from Europe and North America to a multipolar world where countries as China, Russia, and Brazil have an increasing and an enormous amount of power that was not there before. So that's one mega trend. The other one, I think, is globalization. So 1989, I think, was really a point, a paradigm shift. 1989 was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and exactly 30 years ago this month, Tim Berners-Lee wrote the code for the World Wide Web. And that really made a fundamental shift, I think, in what the understanding of globalization is and how people experience it with instant photos and films and videos and news accounts, and the possibility for incitement of violence that we have never seen before. So the rise of terrorism and violent extremism is quite new. I think that at the level it is being we have seen in recent years, and so for any little group to become very powerful is something that is quite unique in this, or even individuals who can have a dramatic influence on political events, whether it's Julian Assange or the leader of Boko Haram, by having a small group of people wreaking a lot of havoc in the Lake Chad basin. And I think that's quite unique to the world we're living in at this moment. So a lot of the increase in violent conflict is in this belt from northern Nigeria through South Sudan to Yemen, up to Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so there is, I think, a little bit of a counteraction to this globalization, where the idea that everything is the same and everybody is the same, and the presentation as things need to be perfect, to a reaction in terms of what you see in national populism, that people need to feel rooted in their particular environment, in their particular identity or their particular locality. And that is something that need to be countered by creating another sense of identity that is more based on a nation rather than on a particular group.
Well, time is well over our designated time, so I have to conclude our session. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.